All right, welcome everybody to the first of our semi-plenary sessions for the conference. Really excited about this one personally. The Jumbunna Institute for Indigenous Education and Research has been a really great supporter of us in bringing this conference together. When I decided we were bringing the conference to Australia, it was really important to me that we had Indigenous voices, First Nations voices, really front and center of the program. And so having Auntie Rhonda this morning, for example, which Jason facilitated for us, who's one of our speakers now, was really important for us as a way to start off the conference. And we wanted to have Indigenous voices in the semi-plenary sessions as well. So really happy that we've got this session on restoring country and revitalising economies. And I want to thank Jumbunna and Jason and all of the panel for all the help and support you've given us in pulling the conference together. It's been really, really important. So this panel is three great speakers from here at UTS. Professor Robin Quiggin, who is the Interim Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Indigenous Leadership and Engagement, and the Executive Director at Jumbunna Institute for Indigenous Education and Research. Professor Craig Longman, Professor of Practice again at the Jumbunna Institute, and also a barrister at Black Chambers, and Professor Jason DeSantolo, Professor First Nations Land Justice, also at Jumbunna Institute. So I'm going to hand over to, I think, Robin to start us off, and we'll hear from each of the speakers, time for some Q&A and everything as well. So over to you, Robin.
Thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone. It's yes. This mic. Oh, okay. I'll use the lectern. Thank you. Thank you. You'll know if people can't hear me. I guess if people online can't hear me.
They'll hear you as long as you're using one of those now.
Right. Thank you. Sorry. Wanted to kick off a bit more with a bit more panache than just talking about the logistics, but there we go. So I want to begin, as we always do, by acknowledging country. And I know that Chris mentioned Auntie Rhonda earlier, who is a great colleague of ours, traditional owner, custodian of this country. And I acknowledge that she welcomed you earlier, a really important ceremony for anybody on our place, on this Gadigal land. So I acknowledge, as a Wiradjuri person, my people are from Fairway out west. Oh, so I do this. Thanks. Thanks.
Sometimes it just needs.
I'm ironing out the bugs for these fellas here.
A reminder of.
That's all right. So I'm from further west. My country. I'm a guest. I'm a Wiradjuri person, a guest on Gadigal country. My people come from, there we go, thanks. My people come from this kind of country, flat, some rolling hills, the Lachlan River, taking a photo from my car while I'm driving, which I shouldn't have been, but anyway, beautiful country, now often used for sheep and wheat. We're river people, the Lachlan River, the Calare River, about 8 hours west of here. So I'm descended from this country, not this country. And every day that I am on this country or the country that I live on, Camaragal country, just over the harbour, I acknowledge that fact. And I speak to country as we do and say, you know, I'm grateful for being here. And I express a hope that I will live in accordance with the ways of that country. Well, I don't know that for Camaragal country, and I can learn, we learn slowly from Auntie Rhonda about this country. I don't know much about how to live on Camaragal country, but if my heart is open to that and I come in the right spirit to that place and tell that place, as we do, who I am, where I'm from, who my people are, and that I come as a as a grateful guest on that country, then I am living by the protocols to the extent that they are knowable. for that country. And so I am abiding by the rules of this place, and I'm doing what we do, Craig, Jason and myself, and what we want to talk to you about today. It's about centering Aboriginal people, our knowing of this country, our respect for this country, and the importance of it in the work that we do. So I do that, as I do that as a sort of daily practice. It is one way in which, apart from in my work, that I think about and reflect on my place in this nation state, on this land, on this place. And so we want to talk to you today about ways, the many ways in which we can collaborate towards change in the way country is understood, managed and viewed in our economy, financial system and in our legal system. For those who might be online, I think or those of you that are visiting, I'm not sure whether there are many international guests that here, Chris, I just want to say that, we come to this as a way of talking about this place because this country belonged to Jason's and my ancestors and the ancestors of this place for 65,000 years until roughly 200 years ago, when it was taken piece by piece, which a process which began not far from here, and then was moved across the nation state. What was to become the nation state, taken piece by piece through invasion, wars, introduced diseases, internment of our people on missions and reserve, the forced removal of our children, and many other techniques to disrupt and harm our land practices, our care for country, our care for each other, our governance structures, our marriage structures, our social structures, our economic structures, to entirely disrupt as best was possible at the time, and clearly not in its entirety because we're here today, but really serious attempts to really disrupt and harm the people of this place, to take it over. We're an eclectic group, the three of us. We are examples of ways that transformational relationships can be forged and how we can work together. We're probably a bit of an unlikely group. I was thinking about what do we got in common. The three of us are lawyers, which is probably unusual. I think it's kind of strange for us to think about that. Craig is still practicing at the bar, and so neither Jason or I are practicing, but we are legally trained. Jason has a really deep knowledge and engagement and practice in Indigenous methodologies, and is also a filmmaker. I was asking Jason if Craig had any creative talents, and I understand that Craig is actually an actor, not just in front of Your Honour, but at the bar, but also in theatre. And for me, I bring nothing. I got no creative talents at all. I just do this work, and but we share together in our hearts a real centering of Indigenous worldviews that is absolutely critical to the work that we do, to understand the importance of land, that land is living, that land, water, species, sky, air, minerals, and all the places and stories and knowledge of and sites and objects of this place are living and really important to this place, to Aboriginal people, but also to this nation, to this planet. And I think that I was thinking about this, the nature of the conference as well, and I'm making a bit of an assumption here that many of you in the idea of transformational partnerships is to be disruptors of something, to work together. And I think that I don't know that there is a person among us who reads the papers or understands what's happening on the planet, and knowing that we've had our warmest days would not have some commitment to being a disruptor to the system that is currently looking like killing the planet, the very planet that we live on. So I make that assumption that we all share in some way, some sense that we work together to change something, to disrupt something. Maybe it's really small, to disrupt or support something. The other thing that's fundamental to the way that Jason Craig and I work together is that we locate ourselves in the work. And I think that's something that's really important in any kind of transformational work. And certainly it's become, as I reflect on the work that I've done over the years in relation to legal work for Indigenous peoples and in financial services, locating where power sits is so important. We can do a lot of things around the edges, and I'll talk about some of those things, but really locating ourselves in the power that we have and the privilege that we have is a really important perspective, I think, to bring. And I think we share that as colleagues together, that we are able to do that. You know, when I reflect on my own power to some extent, you know, I'm as an Aboriginal woman, I am somebody who, you know, when I walk into this university, I have a precarious and temporary kind of power by virtue of the education that I've gotten and the role that I have here and by virtue of the income that I have. I have a kind of precarious power. It's really dependent on all of those things. But when I drive in the little country town that I live in, when I drive in what's quite a nice car, it's not a really flash car. I think that was the car I was in, it was a Mazda 3. Like, we're not talking about a Porsche or anything all that flash, but a nice car in a country town. I drive past the police and I think, my car's too flash. And I watch the rear vision mirror to see whether they will come back and see who's driving the flash car. So my power is precarious and it shifts and changes, you know, depending on where I am. But I think it's really important that we all think about it. I think if you live in a world where you're often in the dominant society, don't necessarily always think and interrogate, where is my power located and how do I exercise it? And am I mindful of the power and the dynamics for others? Lots of women, you know, I think about this for women. I see, reflecting on this the other day, you know, if we have, you know, lots of women in our society, in this country, have comparative amounts of power, and yet we have totally unacceptable rates of family violence that are killing us as a gender at absolutely unacceptable rates. So I think it's a really, you know, it's for all of us, it's a good thing to reflect on every so often, and certainly in the work that we do, in the strategic work that we do, locating ourselves in relation to power is really important. And so how do we think about that differently? How do we kind of, as Indigenous people, in strategic ways, in the kind of trying to drive change, to respect this place for all of us? How do we try and flip that so that we can exercise what we know is a more caring and kind and sustainable way of looking after this country? One other thing I wanted to talk about was the fact that so many of the ways that we often think about that in this country is that seeing as Indigenous peoples as an add-on. You know, we have a reconciliation action plan, and we're you know, you have a kind of big institution and there is some sort of Indigenous thing that kind of runs up the side as a sort of, you know, a sort of thing that's stuck on the side of the institution that is part of the institution, but not in the heart of it, not part of business as usual. It's a thing that is done. It's a sort of often seen as a sort of nice to have, or something that you have because it's the right thing to do for lots of corporations and organisations, and people's hearts are in the right place. But it's often really difficult to get a proper embracing of Indigenous values in these other systems. And institutions can find this, with the best will in the world, can't find this hard to do because traditional organisational principles are not designed to incorporate intruders into their system as we are, because we hold different values. They're usually driven by transactional processes, including profit, shareholder interest, company constitutions, the scope of authority set out in legislation for statutory corporations. So they're often driven by really different dynamics to one that Indigenous people might bring. Not to say that we have not made our way into the heartland of lots of organisations, corporations, institutions and government. As you would all know from watching the TV, we have a number of First Nations ministers now, and lots of leaders around the country. But the way that we do things really is still up for a lot of challenge. I watched this morning, actually, Catherine Liddell, who's the CEO of SNAKE, our children's advocacy group, commenting on the closing the gap statistics that were released today and how poorly we are doing as a nation in the national indicators that we've chosen. And she was saying that the methodology that we use is really flawed. She talked about the kind of short-termism that when you think about sustainability is a real problem. Sustainability really requires a long horizon as a way of seeing things. And we'll talk more about that, as Craig will talk more about that. But we have often programs that are given pilot status. I will let you pilot it for a while. And then we have a change of government and there's this kind of churn. So nobody really gets a real foot into making change. And things are at the whim of different governments' views on things. We've got, you would have to be living under a rock to know that we live in a country that has really shifted from one ideological focus to another. And the way that we think about Aboriginal children has really been part of that as well. She was talking about using a test and implement methodology instead, and also calling out the need to measure things properly, to measure the right things. So instead of this short-termism that focus on pilot and turning things over and never really measuring and seeing what the long-term outcome of something is, taking a much different approach. So we are in these conversations. We are here. We are, really sort of talking about how to make change. But we need to think about these things differently again. And I wanted to talk to you, another example is some of the sort of mystification, the sort of obfuscation that goes on in some of the carbon credit conversation, some of the other things that we really need to get right. We really need to get right how we deal with climate, and yet we sort of get stuck in these poor methodologies. I want to talk to you a little bit about the way that so many approaches to Indigenous work focuses on, and my example of that, because I've worked in the financial services sector, my example of that is that banks, superannuation funds, we want to do cultural awareness training and we want to run an education campaign for Aboriginal people. Could you just stop, please? Could you just stop and have a look at how your own system works? Could you have a look and see how you relate to your customers? Do you have a customer service section that is going to be able to hear people speaking in different languages? Do you have a customer service section that will understand when people move and be able to keep, for example, with superannuation, they might move in remote areas where the spelling of the place changes, is heard differently. So many complexities about when we come in to use the institutions that really, you desperately want to say that please just look at yourself. This is the thing about locating power, that we reflect back on ourselves and ask ourselves, what are we doing and how are we doing this work, and interrogate ourselves. And honestly, the financial services thing, you just want to kind of rock back and forth going, okay, because they're going to do it, they're going to do it. And some of them do it well, and it's not because people don't care. And it's not because cultural awareness training, cultural safety training, and all those things are not important. It is good to exchange knowledge. I'm not saying it's not. But honestly, we really need to have a bit of a different look and think about things a bit differently, and interrogate the power and interrogate the flow of the capital, interrogate what's going on in a bit more hard-nosed way, because those things can be and have been really used against us. And I want to just give you an example of two ways in which those kind of methods like cultural awareness training, cultural understandings, which I am not saying are bad things, they really are. The more we understand each other and encourage inclusivity, they are really, really important. But they get co-opted. They've been co-opted, particularly in that financial services system. We always talk when we're talking in corporations about how we do things differently as Aboriginal people, about the fact that we are relationship focused. We think about the relationships with land, with water, with country, and with each other. And lots of institutions, as I was saying, are very transactional focused. There are two examples in the Aboriginal consumer space where that relationship focus has been really used against us. And I just want to tell you the story of them, because I think we need to kind of keep our eye on where things, where we're going in those kind of strategic and transformative partnerships and interrogate them for their effectiveness. The Aboriginal community, I'll try and tell these stories quickly. I said to Craig and Jason that I wouldn't talk for long, and I've got looking at my watch now. The Aboriginal Community Benefit Fund, or UPLA. Did any of you, I'm going to ask this question, I'm going to sound like expose the fact that I'm a complete nerd. Did any of you watch the Banking Royal Commission live? No? Why did you miss something exciting? It was actually really interesting for some of us. So a lot of this was exposed in the Aboriginal, in the Banking Royal Commission. So the Aboriginal Community Benefit Fund was not an insurance company. It's one of those really tricky products that was set up that really sort of slipped through the cracks, so it didn't get caught by good consumer regulation. It was a funeral payment scheme, not paying for the funeral, but a funeral benefit payment scheme. So you pay for the funeral and then they would reimburse you. They didn't pay out for funerals if you moved to, for funerals. They did pay out for funerals, but they didn't pay out for suicide. They had a suicide exclusion. And if you know our communities, we have very tragically high rates of youth suicide. That's excluded. And I had cousins who, my age now, but who, when their children were born, they signed their babies up. They registered their birth and they signed their babies up for their funeral, because our communities can't bear with our regular mortality rates and $7,000 for a funeral. They cannot bear that impost regular cost. No one's got a lazy $7,000 hanging around. So people were really wisely and financially responsibly trying to protect against those kinds of financial shocks. And ACBF absolutely took people to the cleaner. Sometimes they were effective, sometimes they were, but they were really, they had really heavily intensive. This is not an Aboriginal business, right? Let's be clear. This is owned by a fella who's living in the offshore in the Solomons, a white fella, property on the Gold Coast, living in the Solomons, not Aboriginal, no Aboriginal connection at all, but always sending people out, door knocking until that became illegal, always sending Black people, not necessarily Aboriginal people, but migrant Black workers out to engage with us, really relationship focused, really talking to us about, you know, what happens if you pass away and your family's stuck with the bill, and you all know that, the cell. So they really, really worked on relationships with us. I worked for ASIC for a number of years, and ASIC took them to court for misleading and deceptive conduct because their promotional material was covered in Aboriginal art, Aboriginal colours, took them to court for misleading and deceptive because they're not an Aboriginal business, but could not nail them could not get the litigation up with sufficient degree of prospect of success to take them out for unconscionable conduct, for this unfairness that they were running and the things that were not true about them. Eventually they changed hands. Shortly after the Royal Commission, they had put in this poor bloke who gave evidence to the Royal Commission. He was new. I think he was promised this great job. He didn't know he was going to end up on TV, the Royal Commission, with his head hung low. He didn't know what was going on. Anyway, then they changed hands and then they went bankrupt. We now have thousands of people who had these long payments for these funerals that have got nothing. And now and financial counsellors tell me that it won't be, you know, that in the foreseeable future we will have people in morgues and families unable to bury them and unable to get any kind of access to these funds. The liquidator thinks there might be some money to be restored, but, you know, so this kind of relationship base and this, you know, we really understand Aboriginal people can be really used and the idea that we want to understand and do culturally appropriate things can be really used against us unless we think about where the power is and follow the power and follow the money. The other example I just want to tell you about quickly is it's called ASIC and Cobalt. The case is ASIC and Cobalt, K-O-B-E-L-T. And he ran a business in a little town called Minterby. I don't know if any of you know the APY lands in South Australia, tiny little place in the middle of the desert. Only shop. He ran Book Up for years and years and years. Another one, property on the Gold Coast. Book Up is informal credit. You can go, you know, lots of people use it in the country, particularly in the country and in rural areas. You just look, it's just informal credits, you know, I'm good for this $20, I'll pay you when I get paid. Fine. Lots of people, absolutely. And you might have people might keep a record of it in a shop or in a taxi or whatever business they're running. This guy took your key card and your PIN number. And then and this massive captive audience of the Aboriginal community of the APY lands holding their PIN numbers and their key cards, and they could only shop there. For years, ASIC gathered the evidence, and ultimately, I left by them, but took it to the court. They lost in the first hearing, won in the full federal court, but lost in the High Court because the High Court said, "Oh, people did it voluntarily. People did it because he was there, because he had a relationship with people. He would help them if they needed help." This whole kind of narrative again of relationship and of our cultural values being used against us in this context of unfairness. So I just want to bring you those stories because we think about these sort of soft skill things as valuable, and they are, but they can really be used to unsettle and to give people bad outcomes. And again, that's why I say we have to really kind of follow the money and follow the power. So I'm just going to skip to thinking about these things and thinking about how we use finances and the law. There's a really strong movement at the moment, and Craig will talk to you much more about this in relation to sustainable finance and to litigation and directors' duties in relation to climate and in relation to Indigenous peoples. I probably talked long enough, so I won't actually go far into that, but there's a real possibility now and movement in the courts, but movement in sustainable finance sectors where we are developing taxonomies for sustainable finance, taxonomies for ensuring that there are penalties and regulations for nature-related harm. And we are moving into that space too, to ensure that an investor, who knows about Juukan Gorge? That the investor, where something like that's been done, some kind of damage like that has been done on country, can know that they and their shareholders will know and be advised not to do that kind of thing, to work with Aboriginal communities, to encourage people to really have an interest in heritage, to not run the risk of that kind of reputational damage. So not just BHP, but those who invest in, and the shareholders who invest in those corporations, thinking about climate, thinking about the impact on country, thinking about heritage, and thinking about how financial institutions, big super funds, investors, big banks, think about how the kind of impact that they have on Aboriginal people as well as climate at the moment. It's a really rich area. I'll probably stop talking now and say to you that Craig's going to talk a whole lot about this, and Jason as well. And I think he might. But I want to just say to you, I really want to just leave you with a message that, in that kind of idea of transformative relationships and how we think about ourselves, reflecting on the power that we have, reflecting on how other actors are utilising the power that they have. And really also, the other thing that I think is really follow where the money goes, and not get caught up in the fluffy things like where culture can be used in a way that is actually detrimental to us. I think we're moving into a really new era now, an era of more sophistication and different standards. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name's Craig. I just want to locate myself to start with. Firstly, I want to acknowledge Country and acknowledge the welcome from Auntie Rhonda this morning. I am a non-Indigenous man, so I was born in New Zealand, but my people come from Ireland, Scotland, and England. So everywhere I am on this country, and I live in Camaragal country as well, everywhere I am on this country, I acknowledge that it's not my country and that it's owned by sovereign nations that never ceded their country. I also want to acknowledge the generosity of my colleagues at Jumbunna, because when I came to Jumbunna about 10 years ago, I was the epitome of a young white civil rights lawyer who was going to save the world. And through much patience and slow conversations, I had to do some disruption of myself and identify where my power lay and where my power and its existence was predicated upon an injustice and what I would do about that. So I'm going to change my order of things, which usually the judge would not know, but I have a PowerPoint, so you're going to see that I'm doing that. But certainly one of the most sort of informative experiences in my legal career was one of the first cases I worked on was the death in custody of Palm Island man Morinji Dumaji and the criminal defence of Lex Wotton that arose from that. And I thought that a well-reasoned argument with suitable evidence would secure justice. And that was really the first time I was awoken to the fact that my training in law school had fundamentally ill-prepared me for operating within the structural power that is law. Unless I was willing to be a service provider effectively and represent someone for a breach of contract, if I wanted to change things, operate with any kind of impact, I had to reinterrogate what law is, and I had to be much more critical about law. And we are now starting to do that in our law schools, but still very slowly compared to some of the other countries in the world, in particular America. So when we operate in community, we operate under some of those methodologies that have existed from those critical theory law schools in the States. And there's one that I want to introduce you to, and you'll have to excuse me for a moment while I flick through. So this is a quote from a book called Rebellious Lawyering. Rebellious lawyering is one of a number of kinds of lawyering theory that came up in response to the civil rights movement. Because whilst I was taught about the civil rights movement in law school as a great victory, as I was taught Mabo was, nothing changed on the ground until the people changed on the ground, until there was enough people power and political power to pass the Civil Rights Acts, which then allowed the federal government in America to start prosecuting cases under civil rights violations in circumstances where the states had no interest. So even some of the cases we see today out of the states that look like great victories for law, they're prosecuted as civil rights violations because homicide prosecutions still don't get up. So this quote is very valuable, I think, because it recognizes a number of things. Firstly, that almost all struggles and attempts to change the world start and are empowered from community-led grassroots actions. Secondly, it identifies that much of our power actually resides in our communities and our role as human beings before it comes to us through our role as lawyers, for example. And this line in particular, from a lawyer's perspective, I think is valuable. Mindful of how we sometimes get hemmed in and corrupted and diluted by big institutions and tiny habits. So for me in law, that is professionalism, the idea of the professional lawyer. And in Australia, the idea of the professional lawyer is a hired gun. I have no allegiance to the people I'm representing beyond their legal interests. I do my job with the utmost professionalism. I collect my check and I move on. And that model does limits the change you can do, but it also does terrible things to the lawyers that we generate. So one of the things I hear consistently from lawyers, and I think these observations are probably true about many of the professions, is they get to the end of the law degree and something's been taken from them. That part of them that's human, that wants to go out and change the world, they've been told to shelve that for 4 years. And if you do that, you can't go in and work in a First Nations community. One of the first realizations I think I made when I walked into a community as a lawyer is I am part of the problem. I am literally the problem, right? I am a white, male, middle-aged, believe it or not, lawyer. I not only look like the judges that signed off on the child removals and continue to do so, look like the police officers who arrest community members and take them into custody. I'm trained in the same way, and I am socialized in the same way. So one of the words that came up for us when we were talking about this talk is disruption. And if you are seeking to facilitate the introduction of Indigenous values into renewable energy or just transitions, and you're not yourself Indigenous, then you have to be willing to be disruptive in your own sense of self. You have to be uncomfortable, and you have to be willing to give up power. And so lawyers, we do not like to give up power. So one of the things that's central to Lopez's lawyering strategy is a different way of seeing the client. So they're not clients, they're collaborators. It's a recognition that your client has more expertise in how, in this case, the law in fact works than you do for your 4 years, from your 4 years in law school. One of my favorite anecdotes was a young legal aid lawyer who was working in Central Australia, and he had sat his client down and he did 15 minutes on the Sentencing Act and what would be aggravating and mitigating factors, et cetera, et cetera. And his Indigenous client said, "I've got John, he's going to give me 2 months." And that's, now that client was a better lawyer than his lawyer. But that is a hard thing to come to terms with. So Lopez talks a lot about what's your expertise. Now, I have some expertise that my clients will not have. I can settle a pleading. By dint of my training and where I come from, I've probably got more in common with the judge than my client does. So I have a better way of how they're thinking. But that expertise should not exclude the expertise of my client. So that's a central part of how we work, is identifying the expertise of our clients and how our own worldviews are limiting and trying to address those. So the other thing that we're seeing more and more in the international arena and domestically in terms of Indigenous nations asserting their interests and rights are these more general strategic lawyering approaches. And what a strategic lawyering approach is it is fundamentally different to a normal lawyering approach. And consequently, it gives you fundamentally different opportunities to allow your clients to assert their interests, but it also creates different risks for projects that fail to properly partner with communities. The reason is, unlike a lawyer who usually gets a client come through the door, when I meet with a community, they tell me what they want to accomplish. And I will never say, can't do that. There's no such thing as a legal proceeding that can do that for you. Because my job is to figure out, in the terrain in which I operate, how do I accomplish that or get as close to it as possible? So we don't focus solely on the legal sphere. We look at politics, we look at media, we look at things like finance, sustainable finance. We center our clients in the work we do, so their story centers the cases. So even if we lose, and we'll often have clients say to us, I know we might lose, but I want to be heard. Even if what I say is going to irritate the judge, even if what I say is irrelevant to your proceeding, it is a stage and I want to be heard. And within the bounds of your ethical obligations, you can do that, okay? You can find ways to do that. So, and then the other thing, that part that ties in with this kind of lawyering too is accountability. So you're accountable to your client communities in a way that you're not usually accountable to a client, right? So if a client doesn't like your work, particularly in criminal law, which is I do a lot of, quite often they don't like your work because they're going to jail. But the system has in fact worked. Whereas the accountability that I have back to community is rarely ever, did we win? It is, how did you do what we asked you to do? Did you do it with integrity? Did you do it respectfully? And partly that is because the communities I work with are far more aware than I will ever be about how loaded the game is against them. So strategic lawyering is about taking tactical opportunities. And another reason that translates into different kind of risk is I can succeed in my strategic lawyering aim while losing in court. Okay. So there's an example that I wanted to talk about because it's a well-known one. Who here knows about Sharma? Guessing most of the room. Okay, so Sharma was a proceeding brought seeking to establish a novel duty of care against the Minister for the Environment, alleging that when that minister exercises their functions under the Act, they have to consider the interests of young people. Sharma was the first time the argument had ever been run in Australia. It's an argument that's being run all over the world with different levels of success. There was, on no stretch of the imagination, could you think that Sharma was only run on the basis that it would win. It won at first instance. It went down on appeal. And I've heard lawyers say Sharma was a loss. But consider this. Sharma, first of all, put a spotlight on the evidence regarding climate change. When Sharma was run, there was a strong campaign by the federal government at the time to deny climate science. But one of the values of a courtroom is when Sharma led their scientific evidence, the government did not contest it. And they did not contest it because no barrister would get up. This is speculation, but it's, I think, what happened. No barrister will get up and put a proposition to a court that they don't have evidence to put. It's a breach of ethics. And if you do it, you're in a world of hurt. So even if the government wanted to run a line that we don't believe the evidence, they couldn't run it in the courtroom. And so one of the stories of Sharma was the evidence is in fact settled. Whatever the government says, it's rhetoric because they didn't put any expert witnesses in the stand to go against the evidence. One of the other things Sharma did was it generated this passage out of the judgment, which is the first judgment. This was the most extracted passage of all the reportage of Sharma, right? One of the things that judges can be good at is eloquence and telling a very compelling version of the story. And so Sharma also put the spotlight on the federal environment minister to say, how are you approving this project? Think about the children, which is a powerful rhetorical device. So when lawyers are working in these models with First Nations communities, they are not just going to target projects that might have broken the law. They're going to target projects that could be an example that could be set up as an example of how not to do things. They are also, there will be, I guarantee you, there will be litigation filed solely to embarrass a project proponent. And even if that litigation loses, if I'm an investment firm and I've got a mandate to invest my money in a ESG ticked project and one project is getting sued and the other project is not, I'm going to move my money. So before you even get to a judgment, you've got movement, and we'll talk about an example of that now. So I should say too, I should be clear, strategic litigation is just one part of a strategic lawyering campaign, and it's rarely ever the most important part. It's used tactically. Who here knows this case? Anyone? Yeah, okay. So typical Lipa v. Santos, I've given it one case name. Actually, it's multiple different pieces of litigation brought against the Barossa gas fields project off the Tiwi Islands, which was reported, which was characterized as a carbon bomb, that project. Not to mention the fact it went through a number of marine national parks that has turtles and sharks, which I personally found abhorrent, but that's because I love turtles and sharks. And so I just want to run through quickly the timeline to give you a sense of how sophisticated these kind of campaigns can be, okay? So in March, the Commonwealth regulator gave permission for this project to go ahead. The next month in April, members of a number of Indigenous groups on the Tiwi Islands and also members of Larrakia country went to South Korea and sought an injunction against the South Korean bank that was investing in the pipeline associated with the project. Just filing that case led the South Korean government, and the basis of that case was they had failed to obtain free prior informed consent from us before they granted approval. Just on the filing of the case, the South Korean government put a handbrake on $700 million worth of investments in that project, a month after the approvals landed. There's then a judicial review application against the approval, and that application broadly is that under the law that applied to the case, there was an obligation to consult with traditional owners, not just with the land council. So we know there's a lot of projects in the pipeline at the moment where proponents think that consultation with the land council is sufficient. It's probably not. All right. So on the filing of that judicial review application, an injunction was sought. An injunction is an order from the court that stops work effectively. And Santos said, look, we will stop adding on to anything and doing extra work. We'll give that undertaking to the court, but please don't give us an injunction. And part of the evidence that they gave was that a delay to the drilling would cause a daily loss in the order of hundreds of thousands of dollars and potentially impact the schedule. So hundreds of thousands of dollars a day. And I will say this is consistent broadly with some of the evidence about what delays to projects cost. And those delays, the costs related to delays to mining projects, one would assume would have at least some relation to the costs of large-scale renewable energy projects. The federal court travelled to Tiwi Island to take evidence. This is unusual in a judicial review application, and it was done by the solicitors so the community could give evidence on country and they could point to the spaces and tell the judge. That is a very sophisticated rhetorical tactic. If you're standing in a courtroom and you're telling the judge, imagine a pristine reef, think about the impact that has on you as a judge versus here is this reef. So they went to the Tiwi Islands to take evidence. The community got up at first instance. And what that does with an administrative review challenge is it wipes out the approval. It's gone, as if it never existed, puts the entire project on hold. Santos then files an appeal against that judgment. And at the same time, they release a statement to the Australian Stock Exchange saying, we do not anticipate any material cost or effect on our share price from this judgment. Immediately, the lawyers write to, was it ASIC or ACCC? They write to both. They write to ASIC and ASX, and they said, hold on a minute, this is misleading and deceptive conduct. Because they've just told their shareholders that there's no impact on cost or share price, but they told the federal court under oath that it's hundreds of thousands of dollars a day. How do they sit together? Right? So that's what I mean by, that's not the client saying, oh, this is happening. To have gone that quickly, one can infer that the lawyers were waiting. They knew that they were probably going to do something like that, and they were ready to go. So that's still on foot at the moment. The regulator then in January this year gave Santos a direction saying, actually, there's a new act about underwater cultural heritage. You haven't done a survey. You have to do that. And Santos said, okay, we'll hold work while we do that. Sorry, and I should say Santos's appeal is dismissed by the federal court. So the approval's gone. They have to start again. Even though they've won that fight, this campaign continues. So the next thing that's done is in April 2023, Mr. Tipikala and others file complaints through complaint mechanisms with 12 banks that are financing this project. A lot of banks and financial institutions now have what we would think of as soft law complaint mechanisms where you can complain to the bank and they have to address their complaint. And the complaint is it's a breach of human rights. There's no free prior informed consent. So they've attacked the financing of the project once again. And at the same time, legal complaints were sent to 20 of the superannuation funds that were invested in the project. Again, saying breach of human rights. I love this case. I think this case is the business. This is one of those cases you drink a glass of wine while you read. It's wonderful. And so now, and one of the things that's useful to understand about this case too is it has now taken so long to even try and get the regulation back that the federal government has changed policy. And there are costs associated now with this project that didn't exist back then. And there's a lot of commentary that's suggesting actually it's too expensive. It's no longer financially viable to run this project. Now, the other thing I want to say about Tipikalipa is, firstly, the administrative review challenge on the approval was around very ambiguous language in the law about who should be consulted and how. And there are similar consultation provisions in numerous acts across Australia and in various states and territories, including some of the provisions in the New South Wales law and policy relating to renewable energy zones. They haven't been tested in the court yet, but that is absolutely going to be on the cards for a challenge. And then the other thing to say about typical LIPA, with the exception of that administrative review challenge, which did depend upon the external legislation, none of the legal proceedings were based on emissions. So every part of those legal proceedings otherwise are available against renewable energy projects, just because those projects are moving towards a transition that we all want does not inoculate them from the kind of challenges that we see across the world by First Nations communities. And First Nations communities have succeeded in some of these challenges. They've stopped a wind farm in the United States, for example, because of a lack of free, prior, informed consent. So this is a diagram that we put together for another case, but this, where you see that blue circle of strategy, that's, oh, it's a touch screen. That was an old man moment, wasn't it? Oh, my pearls. Strategy is client instructions. What does the client want? And 9 times out of 10, client doesn't want to stop the project. They want to be consulted. They want to partner in the project. But if you try and do it without us, then there are lawyers like me waiting in the wings. All right? And then these are just 2 examples of experiences I've had in country. Firstly, this, the one of me in a protest was very uncomfortable for me. I'm not even sure I was admitted as a solicitor at this stage. And the idea of walking in a protest down the main streets of Townsville against police violence, I don't know if people know Townsville, but I don't like Townsville much, was very nerve-wracking. And even like, I really had to get over the idea that a lawyer should be protesting at all. And then the other photo is just interesting because I'd asked the community that was asking us to help them with some governance issues, how do you envisage this organization working? Do you want to write it down for me? And they said, no, but we'll draw a picture in the sand and you can go away and work it out. And that's the other aspect of that rebellious lawyering approach, is a translator. Right? So my job is not to change my client's instructions into what the white legal system would recognize them as. My job is to translate them, to try and get what they want in whatever way I can there. I'm going to end there. I don't know how far over time I've been. Sorry, man.
Nanamanenji, Nainaru, Gadigal country. It's like the first year pay respects to the Gadigal country, elders, past and present, and to any First Nations mob here, from here and around the world. It's a real honour to be here. I don't know why I said I'd go last. You always think, oh no, I'll go last, it'll be easier. But yeah, I just wanted really to acknowledge, say thank you to Chris. It's a real, it's been really wonderful to work together on this conference. I think it's, it's a very nurturing and important space for me as a father and an uncle, and and a blackfellow here in this country. So thank you for doing that work. And I really wanted to acknowledge Auntie Rhonda. Did many people make the amazing welcome this morning? I thought it was really touching. I couldn't make it, but Auntie's been a real leader for us here in the climate justice movement, and a real inspiration. And I think, I just wanted to acknowledge her leadership in the space, and the importance of restoring country. I think is critical for me personally, but linking in with Robin, it's been an amazing journey for me working with Robin, because I'm really into land justice, and I was at this protest, this image here, and if anyone talked to me a few years about finance, I would have been like, nah. Man, we need to be up on country and protecting our homelands and all of this. But I've really learned a lot from Robin, and I believe that, you know, working together in the restoring country and revitalizing our economies is absolutely critical to the future for all of us. And Craig, you know, you can see why we love Craig. You know, he comes up to our homelands, sleeps on swags. But, you know, more importantly, I wanted to recognize the context for this work that we do. You know, I think internationally, a lot of people might think, oh, you know, it's such a nice space. Sustainability. Sitting on country. That is not the context for us. That is not the context for my elders and my people all the way up in the Gulf country here. This is in 2014. I think this is the first protest against fracking that happened in this country. And Craig, for well over a decade, has supported our communities against all of the holistic, absolutely terrifying conditions that our communities live in on a daily basis. There's some kids in here. They're probably seen shotguns swung around in town camps. Police go into our town camps and swing shotguns around. You know, it was only last year that a family was driving back to Borroloola from just 60 k's up the road, and people were chasing them, shooting them with shotguns. You know, so there is white supremacy happening on a daily basis for people who are living on their homelands and for people living here. Over 450 Aboriginal deaths in custody. This is not a joke. So, I mean, I have a long speech. It was going to be amazing. And of course, Craig took up all my time. So I wanted to tell a bit of a story about Yuggawal, my traditional mum here, Nancy McDeany, who is our leader, really. And you can see that she's our leader in this image. She's been really inspiring, and Gadrian Hoosen, my brother there on the right, my nephew, Conrad Rory in the back there. But in particular, this is in 2014. The year later, we had massive protests up in Darwin. And this is part of the Jumbunna approach, the whole idea of partnerships. We're there at the protests as well. So we went up to these protests, and Mum did an amazing speech at one of these protests, and she said, oh, you know, we're going to fight for the land. It's not about the money. It's not about the money. And it was a brilliant speech. You know, it was really inspiring. You know, it's about looking after the land for future generations. It's about teaching these kids our songs and our practices so that they can care for the land through practices and systems of law and governance that have survived and been developed over thousands of years. And anyway, later on that day in Darwin, it's quite a, you know, some people have been to Darwin. Where does everyone go in Darwin in nighttime? You know, anyway, the casino, Darwin Casino is the place where blackfellas are welcomed. You know, Aboriginal people are welcomed into the casino. Try to go to a restaurant. You know, try to sit in a cafe. You know, half the time you get hunted away, but the casino, oh no. Welcome, come in. Come in, spend your money that you don't have. Come in. Anyway, we're all at the casino, and air conditioning. Air conditioning. There's air conditioning there. It's a very hot place. So anyway, the story for this is a family story that I'll share with you. Mum is relaxing after a very long day, and she's on the pokies and the TV is playing and we're all sitting around. And up comes the protest on the TV. And Mum's there, it's not about the money. It's not about the money. And she's tapping the pokies. And, you know, that is the complexity of what we are living in. And, you know, it's not about us being at the casino. It's like, why are we at the casino? Why is that place the only place that will welcome us as a family if you have black skin in this country? So we mobilized, you know, we mobilized around these protests. and lobbied and rallied with partner organizations like Jumbunna, Environmental Defenders Office, SEED, Original Power, Get Up, Environment Centre NT, and there is a raft of things that we coordinate together. And I guess, you know, this protest in particular was against the MacArthur River mine, which a few years later was called out by the Independent Monitor for contamination of water. So in Australia, water tanks pulled into our community because the water was contaminated. And everyone had known that, but it was terrifying for all of the women that were pregnant, for all of the parents that knew that they'd been giving water, contaminated water to their children, and that affects all of their growth. So this is sort of the context that I wanted to share as, you know, just as a starting point for the conference. How are we going for time, by the way?
About 15 minutes.
Okay, great. Let's move on. So yeah, it's been an interesting process working with these two guys this year. This has taken us months and months to get to this point. It's really good having a deadline. But like, it was so funny when I started working with Robin, she's like, can I tell that story? She's like, I don't care about methodologies. Who needs methodologies? Just get on with it, Jason. And I'm like, who cares about finance? Just, you know. But I think, you know, through the process of working together and with Craig's, you know, absolute, you know, gun, legal mind and, you know, strategic lawyering, we've come up with 3 elements that we think are important in this space. And one of them is locating power. And I think, you know, the idea of decolonizing partnerships, you know, really does demand Indigenous-led, you know, approaches and methodologies. And I really wanted to paraphrase Ani Rhonda. You know, she really said, which something was really poignant, I think. It makes sense to work with us as we are holding laws and practices that have sustained us on these lands in Australia for tens of thousands of years. Why don't people want to work with us in the sustainability space and use these things which were born from here? You know, this year is going to be the first time really that sustainability strategy at UTS has even considered us. So we are doing the work here as well. You know, and according to you know, esteemed scholar and one of my mentors, Linda Tuiwai Smith, and Leonie Pihama, you know, Māori scholars that are, you know, very much highly respect. Indigenous research holds 2 intertwined threads of inquiry. The first is based on self-determination and sovereignty, and the second on decolonizing knowledge and systems. So once again, just to reassert, our theories and land-based methodologies are born of this land, and as such are able to see and respond to holistic, relational, and complex climate challenges in creative ways that center people and self-determination. Jumbunna's approach, and I'm really proud, I'm really happy to be back in Jumbunna. As you know, a Jumbunna leader and sister, Larissa Barent, states that Indigenous-led centres like Jumbunna are sovereign Black spaces. We carry and conduct ourselves in ways that determine a resilience that is respectful and resurgent. And then finally, social license and truth-telling. You know, the role of the public university, what is our role? You know, do we have a role today in these things? And I really do believe we do. Australia has really struggled and continues to struggle with its own sense of self and identity. Right now, we're traveling through a very contested moment, and it is a really important time for contemplation and truth-telling. Respectful conversations, which is something that Robin has really led and held at this time. Libraries and university teaching spaces are important places for encountering truth, deep reading and experiencing new perspectives in events and teaching, feeling connected, belonging to something bigger, like this conference. like coming together for the community and for the land. And standpoint and positioning, you know, I think Craig has really articulated that quite beautifully. The idea of the inner landscape, how the inner landscape and our spirit and energy connects to the outer landscape. Let's not forget that we need to stay well and turn up with good energy. We also did a contemplative writing exercise. And I thought you could even do this right now. What is a word that expresses your relationship to the land? That is the challenge that we offered each other as a way to reflect on this writing exercise and this presentation. Robin's, I'm going to give it away. Robin's is listening and permission. Craig's was humility and connection. Mine was honor and courage. How different are they? You know, how different are they? So I really encourage you to think through that, and then think through that again. If you're a father or a mother or a grandmother, what would that word be for my child and for their child? You know, and then you'll start experiencing some of the things that we contemplate as Indigenous peoples. Yeah, and finally, tactical practices. I think, you know, Craig's really touched on that, and so has Robin. The idea of, you know, really fighting for the land in developmental context and understanding that development is not always good for us. Sustainable finance modeling is critically important in terms of social enterprises. There's a lot of demand from our communities for social enterprises for caring for country. We need ethical, sustainable partners for that. And we need to continue to support occupations and blockades on Indigenous lands. I really believe in that sort of thing. So yeah, just to close off, and we're hoping we can get some questions in if there's a moment, maybe not. You know, we acknowledge all of the work that everyone is doing in disrupting capitalism and extractive industry, but we really encourage everyone to be open to taking this work one step further. You know, and being open to Indigenous-led disruption, disrupting the systems at play, and knowing that systems, we can't just rely on systems and governance to guide the way we relate to the land and the way that we relate to each other. And yeah, once again, we're posing a three-prong decoal project, locating power, resetting relationships, and tactical practices. And that's it.
Thank you. That was amazing. Three very different perspectives, and what a great example of partnership, and perhaps unlikely partnerships, it sounds like, as well. We do have time for maybe a couple of questions if anyone in the audience has a question for our panel. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Katerina. Thank you so much for speaking. It's been really quite impressive, and the stories have been really impactful. I'm curious, and I haven't come across the term sustainable finance, and you're talking about disrupting capitalism. So could you speak a little bit to how to reconcile those two things, because they seem like they would contradict one another in my mind?
So I might kick off on that. I think they are contradictory in a way, although they are, which is why I think it's such a fascinating process that's happening at the moment. And I think it's driven by the climate crisis. So capitalism and investment is normally about short-termism. It's about extracting, being really clear that you're going to get profits fast and keep shareholders happy, and that's where you place risk. Your risk profile is all about the return on investment, fast return on investment, because the board's staying in power. You know, like you get kicked off a board if you're not going to, you know, you lose your job as the CEO. You know, there's that whole kind of this investment of people in the system that depends on that. But issues like Juukan Gorge, where, you know, Rio went in and blew the gorge up, and those that that invest in that company are starting to look at risk different, like those sorts of incidents, cause boards and shareholders to look at risk differently. The risk of being done for greenwashing makes boards and companies look at risk differently. The risk of being involved in something that is going to be able to show a really clear, foreseeable damage to people, risk and damage to climate, is making boards and shareholders look at that differently, because they know that they're likely to be held account. There's, you know, this is just a tiny glimpse that Craig gave today of the cases around the country and internationally that are growing a really big body of law, well, an emerging body of law that are sheeting risks home to boards and shareholders and ultimately shareholders, directors, that sits with them, both the corporation and personally. So there's a really interesting matrix of legal responsibility. So not just the company that's the project, running the project, but the company that's investing in it that had some knowledge of what was happening. So sustainable finance is disrupting that short-term profit. Bugger the consequences. Don't worry about what you leave behind. Get in, do the job and get out. And, you know, keep your job and return to investors. Sustainable finance is saying there's this whole risk matrix here. You're going to have to think about long-term, because in 20 or 30 years, people could be coming back to you saying, you might be there probably, but to the corporation or to its current people saying, you caused this. And there's just a different risk matrix that is emerging now. I'm going to give the microphone to Craig, but I want to tell you how I got fascinated by this. I went to a conference because I come out of that sort of consumer financial services thing, you know, really looking at the ways that financial services don't look after Indigenous consumers. So that's not where I came from. And I went to this conference that IAG, the major insurer, had hosted, which was a UN conference for Australia to develop its sustainable roadmap. And I honestly, I sat in law school with my fingers in my ears when they talked about insurance and mortgages. I'm like, tell me when it's over. I don't want to know about this stuff. It's boring. It's awful. You know, who would know that I'd become someone who wanted to watch the Banking Royal Commission on TV? It's a dangerous thing where you can actually end up. But I sat in that room listening to insurers, and what I realised is that they're sitting there thinking about the fact that the entire insurance industry will not exist if we can't save the climate. And I thought, oh my God, here's this woman with her fingers in her ears going, don't tell me about insurance and mortgages, and insurers might save the world. I thought to myself in a very surprised way. So I do think, you know, it's really in the interests of capital and the movement of capital, the successful movement of capital around the place, that they have to now. I don't necessarily think there's anything particularly moral about it. It's a commercial imperative now. And so we talk about sustainable finance, which of course attracts people who are just interested in returns, but it's an interesting meshing of people who do have ethical and moral interests. It's bringing us together. Talk about transformative and unusual partnerships. It's creating very unusual transformative partnerships, which is actually really exciting because it's bringing together some pretty interesting collaborators.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think also, you know, we're talking about disrupting capitalism, not destroying it. And I'm all for destroying capitalism, but that's a longer term project, I think. And, you know, traditionally, capitalists, at least as we're talking about it in terms of board of directors, trustees and superannuation funds, they've seen human rights and Indigenous rights as a legal issue. And the problem with that, in my experience in a place like Australia, is the law has very strong ideological bends in particular directions. Now, I think greed sometimes can be an antidote to that. So I think you're less likely to encounter. My view is the money will move faster than the law, and it is. That is the practical reality. Part of the reason that we're looking at that is, you know, BlackRock's got more capacity to affect change in what other people are going to develop in a day than governments do, short of wholesale regulatory changes in nations. And so the law's quite clear. Noel Hutley's written a number of opinion pieces about this. Directors are now required to consider the impact of climate change upon the value of companies, and superannuation trustees are required to consider it in relation to their asset base. Now, that is because the evidence of disruption has grown and has consolidated into something that boards can't ignore anymore. And I think what we're seeing globally and in Australia is the costs associated with not properly engaging with First Nations communities are going to do that as well. And so how are directors required to discharge that obligation? They're required to understand the risk and mitigate it. Now, unlike something traditionally in capitalism, or in capitalist approaches, I think, non-Indigenous directors can't understand the risk. So, and I'm borrowing from Robin here, a terminology she used in one of our conversations about inching into these systems as a way to inch in and assert power and perspectives in these systems. So directors are going to need expertise on engaging with Indigenous communities. They're going to need to be able to demonstrate to people like me under oath, well, what did we do to make sure that our engagement on this project was actually valid? And that creates an opportunity for nations. I don't think any of us think it's a panacea. We're not suggesting it's the solution, but a reflection I'd have after the last 10 years is we actually don't know yet what really works in terms of social change. I mean, Paddy, one of our colleagues who's an organizer, I would have sworn up and down that you wouldn't get 20,000 people at a Black Lives Matter rally in Australia. And there was relatively little that changed. We actually don't know what changed. But what we do know is we're pushing every lever we could find for 10 years before it happened. So I think that's the context in which we think there's opportunity in the sustainable finance.
There's also international taxonomies developed, so systems for regulating how we think about sustainable finance and sustainability, and those are the places into those regulatory frameworks. Because that's when I come out of that conference, I went, right, as they develop the United Nations, Australia's United Nations Sustainable Finance Roadmap, we now have a holding place for Indigenous peoples, because I just hung on to their coattails and said, no, we need this. So it's in there now, and it will continue to be in the taxonomies and the regulatory frameworks that are being developed nationally, but really led by international taxonomies that we will have to comply with for trade. So I think that.
Yeah, sadly, we are now out of time. Thanks so much for those responses. And please join me in thanking Robin, Craig, and Jason. All right, so we've got a very short break now, and then we've got two keynotes from our sponsors, the CSIRO, coming up in probably just about 10 minutes time now. So this is just a break to go and refresh, and see you back here shortly.